A poor mountain man and his loyal dog bought a rotted wagon for $1. What they discovered inside would expose a conspiracy spanning generations. The bearded hermit counts his last silver coin as sneering townspeople place bets on whether he'll survive the coming winter. Everyone assumes the ragged mountain man will freeze to death alone, forgotten like yesterday's snow. But when an educated traveling teacher seeks shelter in his camp, she recognizes something the town missed, a sharp mind beneath the wilderness exterior. Together, they uncover evidence of systematic murders that powerful families will kill to keep buried. Their investigation threatens to topple an empire built on stolen land and innocent blood. Will they expose the truth and survive the deadly consequences, or become the next victim silenced forever? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The autumn wind cut through Ezekiel Fletcher's threadbare coat as he trudged toward Millfield Trading Post. His loyal dog Buster limped beside him, both showing the gaunt signs of a harsh mountain winter approaching. Zeke's calloused fingers clutched his last silver dollar. The coin represented his final hope for survival. The trading post buzzed with afternoon customers. Conversations died when Zeke pushed through the door. His wild beard and patched clothing drew sneers from well-dressed townspeople. A banker's wife wrinkled her nose and stepped away. Two ranch hands chuckled and whispered behind their hands. Trader Morrison looked up from his ledger with barely concealed disgust. Morrison had seen plenty of desperate mountain folk, but few looked as defeated as the man standing before him. Zeke approached the counter. His weathered face showed no emotion despite the hostile stares. He had learned long ago that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. Morrison gestured toward the back lot where a rotting wagon sat among discarded equipment. The wagon's wooden sides had warped and split. One wheel tilted at an odd angle. Rust covered the metal fittings like a disease. The banker's wife laughed quietly. She turned to her companion and predicted the mountain man would be dead before Christmas. Her friend nodded in agreement. They spoke as if Zeke couldn't hear every cruel word. Morrison quoted his price without looking up from his papers. $1 for the entire wagon. He warned that the wood was probably too rotten for decent firewood. Zeke could take it or leave it. Zeke placed his silver dollar on the counter. The coin caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. Morrison swept it into his cash box with a dismissive grunt. He told Zeke the wagon was his problem now. The ranch hands followed Zeke outside to watch the spectacle. They placed bets on whether the wagon would fall apart before he could get it home. Their laughter echoed across the dusty street as Zeke examined his purchase. Buster sniffed. Around the wagon's base, while Zeke tested the remaining structural supports. The frame seemed solid, despite the rotted exterior. With careful handling, he might salvage enough wood for winter shelter repairs. The wheels could be repaired with mountain ingenuity and determination. Zeke hitched his old mule to the wagon. The animal snorted in protest, but began the slow journey toward the mountain trail. Behind them, the townspeople continued their entertainment at his expense. Their voices carried predictions of his inevitable demise. The mountain path tested every joint and board of the ancient wagon. Zeke walked alongside, steadying the load when the wheels hit deep ruts. Buster trotted ahead, scouting for obstacles that might destroy their precious cargo. Evening shadows stretched long by the time they reached Zeke's remote camp. His shelter consisted of a patched tent reinforced with salvaged lumber. A cold fire pit sat, surrounded by stumps that served as furniture. The camp spoke of a man living on the absolute edge of survival. Zeke unhitched the mule and secured it for the night. He built a small fire to ward off the mountain cold. Buster settled beside him with a weary sigh. Both man and dog understood that winter preparations couldn't wait. The next morning brought the systematic dismantling of their dollar investment. Zeke pried boards loose with careful precision. Each piece of salvageable wood represented potential survival. Waste was not an option when death lurked in every approaching storm. Buster's sudden alertness interrupted the work. The dog's ears perked toward a section of the wagon bed that looked identical to the rest. His nose detected something human senses missed. Years of mountain living had taught Zeke to trust his companion's instincts completely. Closer examination revealed subtle differences in the wood grain. One section had been carefully fitted to disguise a hidden compartment. Zeke worked his knife around the edges until the false bottom lifted free. Inside lay treasures that made his hands tremble. A leather-bound journal, wrapped in oiled cloth, had survived decades of concealment. A small metal lockbox sat beside it, secured with a simple latch. A folded map completed the mysterious cache. The journal's cover bore the faded inscription of Rebecca Walsh. The date read 1869. Zeke opened to the first page with reverent care. The elegant handwriting belonged to an educated woman, documenting her family's journey west. Zeke's reading skills were limited to basic necessities. The journal's complex passages and legal terminology frustrated his efforts to understand. He could make out individual words, but missed the deeper meanings hidden in Rebecca's careful documentation. Thunder rumbled across the mountain peaks as storm clouds gathered. The first drops of rain began to fall when a figure appeared on the trail leading to his camp. A woman approached, a tired horse and seeking shelter from the approaching tempest. Grace Washington introduced herself as a traveling teacher. Her dignified bearing and educated speech marked her as different from the rough frontier types Zeke usually encountered. She asked permission to wait out the storm under his meager shelter. Zeke's natural suspicion warred with mountain hospitality traditions. He gestured toward the dry space under his canvas lean-to. Grace accepted gratefully and began tending to her horse with practiced efficiency. The storm intensified as they shared his simple evening meal. Grace noticed the journal lying open beside the fire. Her eyes widened as she recognized the historical significance of the document. She offered to help decipher the complex passages that had frustrated Zeke's efforts. As Grace read Rebecca Walsh's words aloud, both listeners began to understand they had stumbled upon something far more valuable and dangerous than a simple pioneer's diary. Grace's educated voice brought Rebecca Walsh's words to life in the flickering firelight. The journal entries painted a picture of hope turning to terror. Rebecca documented her family's excitement at discovering gold on their legitimate claim. Her husband Patrick had filed all proper paperwork with territorial authorities. Their 8-year-old daughter, Molly, collected pretty stones while her parents worked the promising site. The early entries sparkled with optimism about their future prosperity. Rebecca wrote about building a real house and sending Molly to school back east. Patrick's mining experience from Ireland served them well in the Colorado Territory. The Walsh family had followed every law and regulation to secure their rightful claim. Then, Bartholomew Crenshaw entered their story like a plague. The wealthy landowner appeared at their camp with legal documents he claimed superseded their filing. Rebecca's handwriting grew more anxious as she described Crenshaw's increasingly aggressive visits. He brought armed men who stood silently while he made his demands. Grace paused in her reading as rain hammered against Zeke's canvas shelter. She explained the legal terminology that had confused him. Crenshaw was using fraudulent papers to steal legitimate claims throughout the territory. The Walsh family had become targets because their strike showed genuine promise. Rebecca's later entries revealed a family under siege. Strange men watched their camp from distant ridges. Equipment disappeared during the night. Their horse was found dead with no apparent cause. Patrick began sleeping with his rifle, while Rebecca kept vigil with Molly pressed close beside her. The journal's tone shifted to desperate urgency as Rebecca documented their decision to flee. They would abandon the claim rather than risk their lives. Patrick buried their mining tools and marked the location with coded references only Rebecca would understand. The family planned to escape under cover of darkness and return with federal authorities. Grace's voice faltered as she read the final entries. Rebecca wrote her last words while hiding in a cave system miles from their original camp. Crenshaw's men had tracked them through the wilderness. Patrick had gone to scout their escape route and never returned. Rebecca could hear riders searching the area around their hiding place. The journal ended abruptly. No final goodbye or explanation marked Rebecca's last entry. The incomplete sentence suggested she had been interrupted while writing. Grace closed the leather cover with solemn respect for the woman whose terror still echoed across the decades. Zeke stared into the dying fire as the implications settled in his mind. The Walsh family had vanished without trace in 1869. Their legitimate mining claim had never been properly transferred or sold. According to territorial law, abandoned claims reverted to government control after specific time periods. Grace pulled territorial maps from her traveling supplies. Her work as an educator required knowledge of land boundaries and local history. She spread the documents near the fire and began cross-referencing Rebecca's careful notations with official survey markers. The revelation struck them both simultaneously. Rebecca's detailed descriptions matched Zeke's current mountain property with stunning accuracy. The hidden cave system, the distinctive rock formations, the seasonal water patterns, all aligned perfectly. Zeke had been living on the Walsh family's legitimate mining claim. Grace explained the legal ramifications with growing excitement. As the discoverer of the original claim documents, Zeke held rights under territorial inheritance laws. The Walsh family's tragic disappearance meant their property claims had never been legally resolved. Zeke potentially owned land worth a substantial fortune. The storm passed during the night, leaving the mountain air crisp and clean. Morning light revealed the true scope of their discovery. The metal lockbox contained additional evidence supporting Rebecca's journal. Survey documents, assay reports, and correspondence with territorial officials proved the Walsh family's legitimate ownership. Grace's legal knowledge proved invaluable in understanding the complex documentation. Her education had included extensive study of property law and territorial regulations. She recognized the significance of each paper and its potential value in establishing Zeke's claim. Zeke's initial reaction surprised her. Instead of celebrating his sudden change in fortune, he insisted on discovering what happened to the Walsh family. The journal's abrupt ending haunted him. Rebecca, Patrick, and little Molly deserved better than simply disappearing from history. Rebecca's coded references led them to the original mining site. Zeke's 40 years of mountain living had taught him to read landscape signs others missed. Rebecca's notes indicated. The discovery site showed evidence of systematic excavation and promising ore samples. More heartbreaking discoveries awaited them among the scattered remnants of the Walsh camp. Molly's small belongings had survived the decades protected by mountain cave conditions. Her carefully preserved doll still wore the dress Rebecca had sewn during their journey west. The child's presence felt immediate despite the passage of time. Grace gathered the evidence with scientific precision, while Zeke processed the emotional weight of their findings. 3 innocent people had died for the crime of following legal procedures to claim their rightful property. Their murderer had built his fortune on stolen land and vanished lives. The teacher's organizational skills complemented Zeke's wilderness knowledge as they documented every detail. Grace understood the importance of creating an unshakable legal record. Her experience with hostile authorities in other territories had taught her the value of overwhelming evidence. Zeke made his decision as they prepared to leave the tragic site. The Walsh family would receive justice, even if it took his remaining years to achieve it. Their deaths would not remain hidden secrets protecting a murderer's legacy. Grace recognized something in the mountain man that others had missed. His weathered exterior concealed sharp intelligence and unshakable moral courage. She offered her partnership in pursuing the truth about the Walsh family's fate and the broader pattern of territorial crimes. Grace's letter to Professor Samuel Hayes at the Territorial Historical Society brought an immediate response. Hayes arrived at their mountain camp within a week, his academic excitement barely contained as he examined the Walsh family documents. The professor's research had uncovered similar disappearances throughout the territory during the late 1860s. The pattern emerged with disturbing clarity. Multiple families had filed legitimate mining claims only to vanish without explanation. Their properties had subsequently been acquired by associates of Bartholomew Crenshaw through questionable legal proceedings. Hayes had documented at least 15 such cases, but lacked the evidence to prove criminal activity. Zeke's discovery provided the missing piece Hayes needed. Rebecca Walsh's detailed journal offered first-hand testimony of Crenshaw's intimidation tactics. The coded references to hidden evidence could lead to additional proof if other families had employed similar precautions before their disappearances. Sheriff Bradley arrived at the camp unannounced 3 days later. His polite demeanor barely concealed the threat underlying his visit. Bradley suggested that Zeke might be happier relocating to a different territory, where mountain folk faced less scrutiny from territorial authorities. The sheriff's casual mention of recent accidents befalling troublesome residents carried clear implication. Grace recognized the intimidation tactics from her experiences in other territories. Corrupt officials used similar approaches to silence inconvenient witnesses. She documented Bradley's visit in precise detail, noting his specific words and implied threats. Her teaching background had trained her to observe and record suspicious behavior patterns. Zeke's response to Bradley surprised both the sheriff and Grace. The mountain man's quiet dignity never wavered, despite the obvious pressure. His 40 years of wilderness survival had forged unshakable resolve. Zeke informed Bradley that he would be staying on his rightful property regardless of any inconvenience to local authorities. The sheriff's departure marked the beginning of systematic harassment. Unknown riders began appearing on distant ridges around Zeke's camp. His few possessions were disturbed when he left to gather supplies. Buster's constant alertness indicated the presence of watchers, even when none were visible. Grace transformed their informal investigation into an organized research project. Her educational experience proved invaluable in creating systematic documentation of territorial crime patterns. She established communication networks with families throughout the region who had lost relatives under mysterious circumstances during the Crenshaw era. The Kowalski family traveled 50 miles to share their story with Grace and Zeke. Their grandfather had discovered silver on a legitimate claim in 1871. Armed men had ordered the family to abandon their property within 24 hours. When they refused, their cabin burned during the night. Their grandfather's body was never found. Similar stories emerged from the Chen and Rodriguez families. Each tale followed identical patterns of legal claims, escalating threats, and sudden disappearances. The survivors had scattered to distant territories rather than risk additional family members. Fear had kept their stories buried for decades. Grace's organizational skills welded these scattered accounts into a comprehensive case against the Crenshaw legacy. Her ability to connect with diverse families overcame cultural and language barriers that had previously isolated the victims' descendants. The shared experience of injustice created bonds stronger than ethnic differences. Zeke found himself reluctantly thrust into leadership as more families joined their growing coalition. His reputation for honest dealing and practical wisdom had spread through mountain communities over the years. People trusted him despite his hermit reputation because his word had never been broken. The mountain man's survival skills now served a larger purpose than personal preservation. His knowledge of wilderness travel and hidden camps provided security for coalition meetings. Zeke's network of hunting trails and supply caches offered safe communication routes between scattered homesteads. Vincent Crenshaw's first direct approach came disguised as a business proposition. The descendant of Bartholomew Crenshaw arrived at Zeke's camp with 2 well-dressed associates. Vincent offered substantial payment for Zeke to relocate and forget about ancient history that had no relevance to modern times. Zeke's refusal triggered Vincent's transformation from polite businessman to barely controlled threat. The Crenshaw heir made clear that his family had dealt with troublemakers before. using permanent solutions. His associates fingered their weapon handles, while Vincent outlined the various accidents that could befall stubborn mountain folk. Grace witnessed the confrontation from her position, documenting plant specimens near the camp. Her teacher's training in reading dangerous situations immediately assessed the escalating threat level. She began moving toward her horse while calculating escape routes through the surrounding forest. Vincent's departure left no doubt about his intentions. The civilized facade had cracked enough to reveal the violence underlying 3 generations of Crenshaw prosperity. His parting words promised that accidents happened frequently to people who meddled in matters beyond their understanding. That night brought the first direct attack on their investigation. Vincent's men ransacked Zeke's camp while he attended a coalition meeting at a distant homestead. They destroyed his winter supplies and scattered his few possessions through the forest. Only Buster's fierce barking had prevented them from finding the hidden cache containing the Walsh family documents. Neighboring homesteaders responded to Buster's distress calls and arrived to find the destruction. The attack had backfired by galvanizing local support for Zeke and Grace's investigation. Families who had remained neutral now offered active assistance in protecting the evidence and witnesses. Professor Hayes brought disturbing news during his next visit. Academic colleagues researching similar territorial crimes had suffered mysterious accidents in recent months. 2 researchers had died in supposedly natural incidents after receiving copies of evidence related to historical land fraud. The pattern suggested someone was actively eliminating threats to long-buried secrets. The coalition faced a critical decision point. They could abandon their investigation and hope for safety through silence, or they could press forward, knowing that powerful forces would use any means necessary to protect generational criminal enterprises built on innocent blood. Grace's proposal unified their resolve. She suggested holding a public meeting at the trading post to present their evidence to the entire community. Transparency would provide protection by making their discoveries too public to suppress through individual intimidation. Professor Hayes arrived at the trading post 2 hours before the scheduled community meeting. His nervous demeanor immediately caught Grace's attention as families began gathering in the main room. Hayes pulled her aside with urgent news that would change everything they thought they knew about their investigation. The federal government had been watching the Crenshaw family for 3 years. Multiple government land agents had disappeared while investigating suspicious property transfers throughout Colorado territory. Hayes revealed his secret coordination with Federal Marshal Thompson, who had been building a case against an extensive criminal network. Grace felt the pieces clicking into place with startling clarity. The murdered researchers, the missing government agents, and the territorial land fraud formed parts of a much larger conspiracy. Vincent Crenshaw wasn't just protecting his family's reputation. He was covering an active criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple historical crimes. Hayes explained that Zeke and Grace's evidence provided crucial missing elements for federal prosecution. Rebecca Walsh's journal offered first-hand testimony of systematic intimidation tactics. The coded references to other hidden caches could expose the full scope of Crenshaw criminal activity spanning multiple generations. The conspiracy reached deeper into territorial governance than anyone had imagined. Corrupt officials, fraudulent land transfers, and systematic elimination of witnesses had created an empire built on stolen property and innocent blood. The Crenshaw family had operated with impunity because they controlled key positions in local law enforcement. Marshal Thompson had been posing as a traveling merchant for months while positioning federal agents throughout the territory. The public meeting provided perfect cover for springing their carefully planned trap. Vincent Crenshaw's expected attempt to silence the coalition would finally give federal authorities grounds for arrest. Grace processed the implications with growing excitement and terror. Their amateur investigation had stumbled into a federal case involving dozens of murders and massive land fraud. The stakes extended far beyond justice for the Walsh family to encompass systematic territorial corruption, affecting thousands of innocent people. Outside the trading post, Vincent Crenshaw arrived with 6 armed associates. His plan was simple and brutal. The coalition meeting would end in a tragic accident that eliminated all witnesses to historical crimes. Fire would consume the building and evidence while authorities blamed faulty heating equipment. Federal agents hidden throughout Millfield watched Vincent's men take positions around the trading post. Marshal Thompson, maintaining his merchant disguise, sat quietly in the meeting room while families shared their stories of lost relatives. The trap was set with precision that reflected months of careful preparation. Zeke noticed the suspicious activity first. His wilderness survival instincts detected the subtle signs of men moving into ambush positions. The mountain hermit, who had lived alone for decades, suddenly found himself responsible for protecting an entire room full of innocent families. Grace saw Zeke's alert posture and followed his gaze toward the windows. Armed figures moved through the evening shadows with military precision. Her teaching experience in hostile territories immediately recognized the coordinated nature of their positioning. This wasn't random intimidation, but organized assault. The trading post's main door burst open as Vincent Crenshaw entered with confident arrogance. His expensive clothing and polished manner contrasted sharply with the weathered faces of mountain families. Vincent announced that the meeting was over and everyone should return home immediately. Professor Hayes stepped forward to confront Vincent with historical evidence of his family's crimes. The academic's courage wavered slightly when Vincent's associates moved to flank him. The threat of violence filled the room like smoke from a dangerous fire. Vincent's facade of civilization crumbled as he revealed the true extent of his family's criminal legacy. 3 generations of Crenshaws had built their wealth through systematic murder and theft. Vincent had personally eliminated researchers who threatened to expose their empire of corruption. Marshal Thompson chose that moment to reveal his true identity. Federal agents burst through multiple entrances as Thompson announced Vincent's arrest for federal crimes, including murder of government officials. The carefully orchestrated trap closed around the Crenshaw criminal network with devastating efficiency. Vincent's desperate attempt to escape ended when federal agents tackled him near the rear entrance. His associates surrendered without resistance when confronted by superior numbers and legal authority. Years of federal investigation culminated in a single coordinated strike that shattered the Crenshaw empire. The evidence seized during Vincent's arrest exceeded everyone's expectations. Detailed records documented 3 generations of systematic crime, including the murder of 23 families. Maps showed stolen properties worth millions of dollars scattered throughout Colorado Territory and neighboring regions. Vincent's confession during interrogation revealed additional shocking details. Recent murders had eliminated academic researchers, government agents, and anyone who threatened to expose historical crimes. The Crenshaw criminal enterprise had evolved from territorial land theft into modern organized crime. Grace realized their amateur investigation had provided the final pieces needed to solve dozens of historical murders. Rebecca Walsh's journal and the Coalition's research had given federal authorities evidence that professional investigators had died trying to obtain. Their accidental discovery had brought justice to generations of victims. Zeke processed his transformation from desperate hermit to federal witness with quiet amazement. The rotting wagon purchased with his last dollar had contained evidence that toppled a criminal dynasty. His insistence on seeking justice for the Walsh family had exposed systematic territorial corruption, affecting hundreds of innocent people. Federal agents revealed the full scope of their investigation during post-arrest briefings. The Crenshaw case connected to similar criminal enterprises throughout the American West. Territorial-era corruption had created networks of violence and theft that continued operating into modern times. Marshal Thompson explained how Zeke and Grace's courage had made federal prosecution possible. Their willingness to risk personal safety for historical justice had provided evidence that professional investigators couldn't obtain. The mountain hermit and traveling teacher had succeeded where federal agents had failed. The trading post meeting ended with federal authorities taking statements from coalition families. Decades of fear and silence finally gave way to official recognition of historical injustices. The Walsh family and other victims would receive the justice that had been delayed but never forgotten. The federal courthouse in Denver filled with spectators as Vincent Crenshaw's trial began 6 months later. Families who had lost relatives decades earlier finally witnessed legal proceedings that acknowledged their suffering. Grace sat in the front row, holding Rebecca Walsh's journal, ready to present the evidence that had started their investigation. Vincent's defense attorney attempted to dismiss the historical crimes as ancient history, irrelevant to modern justice. The strategy collapsed when prosecutors presented Vincent's own confession detailing recent murders of federal agents and academic researchers. His admission of continuing the family legacy of violence destroyed any claim of inherited innocence. Zeke testified about discovering the Walsh family documents and the systematic intimidation that followed. His simple mountain dialect contrasted sharply with the legal formalities, but his honest testimony carried undeniable weight. The jury listened intently as he described finding little Molly's preserved belongings at the abandoned campsite. Grace's testimony provided the legal framework connecting historical land fraud to modern criminal enterprise. Her educational background allowed her to explain complex territorial laws and property rights with clarity that made the conspiracy comprehensible. The prosecution relied heavily on her systematic documentation of family testimonies. Professor Hayes presented academic research linking the Crenshaw crimes to broader patterns of territorial corruption. His evidence showed how the criminal network had operated across multiple states, using identical intimidation tactics. The scope of systematic violence exceeded anything previously documented in territorial history. Vincent's detailed records, seized during his arrest, provided prosecutors with overwhelming evidence of generational criminal activity. Maps showed stolen properties worth millions in current values. Correspondence revealed corruption extending to territorial governors, federal land agents, and territorial judges, who had facilitated the systematic theft. The prosecution's star witness proved to be corrupt Sheriff Bradley, who agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges. Bradley's testimony exposed the network of paid officials who had protected Crenshaw criminal activities for decades. His detailed knowledge of recent murders provided crucial evidence linking Vincent to federal crimes. Vincent's associates received sentences ranging from 20 years to life in federal prison. Their testimony revealed additional criminal enterprises operating throughout the American West, using similar patterns of violence and corruption. The Crenshaw case became the foundation for broader federal investigations into territorial-era organized crime. Vincent himself received multiple life sentences for the murder of federal agents, academic researchers, and historical witnesses. The judge's sentencing statement acknowledged that justice delayed by generations remained justice nonetheless. Vincent's family empire, built on innocent blood, had finally collapsed under the weight of accumulated evidence. The federal government established a compensation fund for families whose properties had been stolen through Crenshaw criminal activities. Zeke's legal claim to the Walsh family property was officially recognized, making him one of the wealthiest landowners in Colorado Territory. His transformation from desperate hermit to respected property owner seemed almost miraculous. Zeke's first major decision involved sharing his newfound wealth with other affected families. He established the Walsh Family Memorial Fund to provide compensation and support for descendants of territorial crime victims. The fund's resources would help families recover stolen properties and document additional historical injustices. Grace accepted a federal appointment as regional coordinator for historical justice research. Her position involved traveling throughout the American West to investigate similar patterns of territorial-era crimes. The federal government recognized that the Crenshaw case represented only one example of systematic corruption that required broader investigation. Professor Hayes received federal funding to establish a territorial crime research center at the state university. His work would focus on documenting and investigating historical injustices that had been covered up for generations. The center would provide resources for families seeking justice for long-buried crimes. The coalition, families who had supported the investigation, received formal recognition from territorial authorities. Their courage in coming forward, despite decades of intimidation, had made federal prosecution possible. Many families recovered properties that had been stolen from their ancestors through fraudulent legal proceedings. Zeke's mountain property became the site of a permanent settlement as families sought the safety and community that had developed during their investigation. His leadership during the crisis had transformed him from isolated hermit into respected community patriarch. The man who had once faced starvation now found himself responsible for the welfare of dozens of families. Grace established a school in the growing settlement to serve the children of coalition families. Her teaching mission found perfect expression in educating the next generation about historical justice and the importance of standing against corruption. The school became a symbol of hope emerging from generations of systematic oppression. The federal government's broader investigation revealed similar criminal networks operating throughout the American West. The evidence from the Crenshaw case provided templates for identifying and prosecuting other territorial-era criminal enterprises. Dozens of additional cases emerged from federal review of historical land records. Buster, now well-fed and healthy, became the beloved mascot of the growing settlement. Children who had never known security played safely in streets protected by federal law enforcement. The loyal dog who had helped discover the hidden documents enjoyed the community celebration he had made possible. Zeke's personal transformation amazed everyone who had known him as a desperate mountain hermit. Clean clothes, regular meals, and community respect revealed the intelligent, capable man who had been hidden beneath years of poverty and isolation. His moral courage had remained constant, even when his circumstances seemed hopeless. Grace documented their investigation in detailed reports that became required reading for federal agents investigating territorial crimes. Her systematic approach to gathering evidence from diverse communities provided models for future historical justice research. The traveling teacher had found her greatest classroom in the pursuit of long-delayed justice. The settlement that grew around Zeke's property attracted families from throughout the territory, seeking honest governance and community protection. Federal oversight ensured that local corruption could not reestablish itself. The community became a symbol of justice triumphing over generational criminal enterprises. 1 year after Vincent's conviction, the settlement numbered over 200 residents, representing diverse ethnic backgrounds, united by their shared commitment to historical justice. Zeke and Grace's partnership had created something unprecedented in territorial history, a community founded on the principle that truth would ultimately defeat systematic corruption, regardless of how long justice had been delayed. The memorial service for the Walsh family took place on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 2 years after Zeke had purchased the rotting wagon. The original campsite where Rebecca, Patrick, and Molly had lived their final days now hosted over 300 people from across Colorado territory. Federal officials, academic researchers, and families who had found justice through the investigation gathered to honor the victims whose story had changed everything. Grace stood before the assembled crowd, holding Rebecca's journal, its leather cover worn smooth from constant handling during the federal trial. She read passages that spoke of hope for the future and dreams of prosperity that would never be fulfilled. Rebecca's words about building a better life for her daughter echoed across the decades with heartbreaking poignancy. Zeke had commissioned a master stone carver to create a memorial worthy of the family whose deaths had exposed generational corruption. The granite monument bore the names of all 23 families murdered by the Crenshaw criminal enterprise. Rebecca, Patrick, and Molly Walsh held the place of honor, but they were no longer alone in death. Professor Hayes presented the historical context that made the memorial significant beyond its immediate tragedy. The Walsh family case had become the foundation for federal legislation protecting territorial settlers from systematic land fraud. Their deaths had ultimately saved hundreds of other families from similar fates. The ceremony's most moving moment came when Grace buried Molly's preserved doll beside the memorial stone. The small toy had survived decades, hidden in the lockbox, waiting for someone to tell her family's story. Children from the settlement placed wildflowers around the grave, while their parents wept for all the innocence lost to greed and violence. Zeke's transformation from desperate mountain hermit to community leader seemed complete as he addressed the memorial gathering. His words were simple but carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. He spoke about the responsibility that came with uncovering truth and the obligation to ensure that justice delayed would not become justice denied. The settlement that had grown around Zeke's property now boasted a school, church, general store, and federal law enforcement office. Grace's educational programs had attracted families seeking honest governance and community protection. The town of Walsh Springs, named in honor of the murdered family, represented everything Rebecca had dreamed of creating for her daughter. Federal Marshal Thompson announced additional developments in the broader territorial crime investigation. The evidence from the Crenshaw case had led to prosecutions in 7 other territories. Corrupt officials, fraudulent land deals, and systematic violence had been exposed across the American West. The impact of Zeke's dollar wagon purchase continued expanding. Grace's work as regional coordinator for historical justice research had uncovered 12 additional criminal networks operating similar schemes throughout the frontier. Her systematic approach to gathering family testimonies had become the federal standard for investigating territorial-era crimes. The traveling teacher had found her life's calling in pursuing long-buried truth. The Walsh Family Memorial Fund had grown into a significant force for historical justice. Zeke's generous contributions funded research, legal assistance, and compensation for families affected by territorial crimes. The fund's resources enabled investigations that would have been impossible for individual families to pursue. Professor Hayes announced the establishment of a permanent research station at Walsh Springs, dedicated to documenting territorial injustices. Federal funding supported ongoing investigations into historical crimes that had been covered up for generations. The academic center would ensure that the search for truth continued long after the original investigators were gone. The memorial service concluded with the reading of names representing all documented victims of territorial-era systematic crimes. Each name honored a life cut short by greed and violence. The litany continued for nearly an hour as the full scope of generational criminal enterprise became clear to the assembled witnesses. Zeke walked through his transformed property after the ceremony, accompanied by Buster and Grace. The mountain camp where he had nearly starved 2 years earlier now anchored a thriving community. Children played in streets protected by federal law, while their parents built futures free from the fear that had haunted previous generations. Grace's federal reports documented their continuing success in bringing historical justice to territorial crime victims. Their partnership had evolved into a model for investigating systematic corruption across multiple generations. Federal authorities throughout the American West requested their assistance with similar cases. The $1 wagon that had started everything now sat in the Walsh Springs Historical Museum as the centerpiece of an exhibit about territorial justice. Visitors from across the country came to see the rotting vehicle that had contained evidence capable of toppling a criminal dynasty. The wagon's transformation from worthless junk to historical artifact mirrored Zeke's own journey. Buster, now the unofficial mayor of Walsh Springs, greeted visitors with the dignity befitting his role in discovering the hidden compartment. The loyal dog enjoyed regular meals, warm shelter, and the admiration of children who understood his contribution to their community's founding story. His barking had saved evidence that brought justice to generations of victims. Zeke's evening routine now included reading federal reports about new cases emerging from their investigation. Each successful prosecution validated their decision to risk everything for historical justice. The mountain hermit, who had been dismissed as worthless, had become instrumental in reforming territorial law enforcement. Grace established correspondence with families throughout the American West, seeking assistance with historical injustices. Her reputation for thorough research and federal connections made her a beacon of hope for those who had abandoned dreams of justice. The Walsh Springs Address had become synonymous with refusing to accept systematic corruption. 2 years after purchasing the wagon, Zeke reflected on the chain of events that had transformed his life and brought justice to countless victims. His last silver dollar had purchased more than rotting wood and rusty metal. The wagon had contained the power to expose generational crimes and create lasting change. The settlement's evening lights twinkled across the valley, where Rebecca Walsh had once dreamed of building a prosperous future for her family. Those dreams had finally been fulfilled, not by the original dreamers, but by strangers who refused to let their story remain buried. Justice had been delayed by decades, but never truly denied. Walsh Springs stood as proof that truth possessed timeless power, capable of outlasting the lies built to conceal it.